Well, hey everybody. Today we are talking about nutritional ketosis and cancer. Obviously, really hot topic. We know that cancer is killing 1,600 people every single day, and anything we can do to help combat that is extremely important in our society. Today we are talking about nutritional ketosis and cancer. And so as we go into this, we're going to really discuss what cancer is and what the ketogenic diet does. And so for those of you guys that aren't fully aware of the ketogenic diet, basically most people are eating a high carbohydrate diet. When we eat high carbohydrates, starches and sugars, our body produces insulin, and insulin helps bring the glucose or the carbohydrate, which breaks down into glucose, into the cell to produce energy. On a ketogenic diet, we keep our carbohydrates, our glucose levels down, and therefore our insulin levels drop, so our body starts to break down stored body fat, and also the calories we're getting are coming from mostly from fat, and so we're utilizing that for energy, and we're creating these ketones, which are metabolic byproducts of fat metabolism that are water soluble, that can cross through the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain to produce amazing amount of energy. So we can't burn fat for fuel in our brain, but we can burn ketones, which are a byproduct of fat. And that's why ketones are so powerful, because they can help fuel our brain during periods of time of fasting. But we're also finding out a lot more about the benefits of ketones. When we look at the mitochondria, if we are a sugar burner and we want to produce energy through glucose, we actually produce a tremendous amount of metabolic stress in order to do that. So we actually create a lot of metabolic waste. So waste products, oxidative stress, a lot of free radicals that are formed when we burn glucose for energy. And sometimes we have to burn glucose. All of us are burning some level of glucose, and whenever we exercise or do anything at a high intensity, we're going to be burning a little bit more glucose for energy. It's very important. It's a quick fuel. But ketones are more of the diesel fuel. They're going to be a clean burning energy source that's really helpful for our body, produces incredible amount of energy and very low levels of metabolic waste. It's like a car that gets incredible performance as well as very good gas mileage. And so that's what we're looking at with ketones. Now, when it comes to cancer cells, we know that there are a lot of differences between cancer cells and normal cells. Cancer cells have an irregular shape. Their nucleus oftentimes is abnormal, right? Larger, darker. They grow out of control, whereas normal cells have a regular check and balance system. And so when a cell starts to form abnormally, it naturally either repairs itself or it gets killed. So when it repairs itself, we call that autophagy, where the cell actually repairs the intracellular organelles that are damaged. When it kills itself, or let's say the immune system kills it, we call that apoptosis, programmed cell death. Whereas cancer cells, they are immature, they grow out of control, and they resist dying. Okay, so they resist autophagy, they resist apoptosis. So very important, and they also hide from the immune cells. Now, they are glycolytic cells. So this is the issue with cancer cells, is they do not produce energy from ketones and fat for the most part. They really just rely on glucose metabolism or an amino acid glutamine. They are fermenters. And so when we look at a normal cell and a cancer cell, there's a German researcher named Otto Warburg who came up with something called the Warburg Effect, where he found that cancer cells fermented glucose to produce lactic acid and also another acid called succinic acid. And a lot of times we hear, especially in the natural health world, we hear things like cancer thrives in an acidic environment. If you are acidic, you're going to produce cancer. But actually, cancer creates the acidic environment. So it wasn't necessarily that you were acidic beforehand. I mean, certainly you were a sugar burner, but cancer actually creates its own acidic environment by basically creating all this metabolic waste in acids, lactic acid and succinic acid. It produces a lot more than the body can buffer. So normally we produce a certain amount of lactic acid, and through the Cori cycle, the bloodstream takes the lactic acid back to the liver and it's converted back into glucose. However, when we produce rampant amounts of lactic acid as well as succinic acid, we're overwhelming the system with these acids. We create our own acid. And you can see this monocarboxylate transporter 4 is upregulated in cancer cells, which diverts the breakdown, the pyruvate, to lactate. And overall, the net ATP produced by a cancer cell is only 2. So adenosine triphosphate ATP is the primary energy source the body utilizes. When we take, in a normal cell, when we take glucose and we roll it through all the different Krebs cycle and electron transport cycle, and so when we do that, we end up with 36 ATP. And so anaerobic glycolysis, again, is only 2 ATP. So with the presence of oxygen, normal cell can produce significantly more cellular energy, but cancer cells aren't able to do that. And of course, normal cells are able to utilize oxygen to burn fat for fuel. And the cancer cell, and this is really where the Warburg effect is, even in the presence of oxygen. So normally we're producing we're creating glycolysis, or we're creating 2 ATP when we don't have enough oxygen, like when we're exercising. But in the presence of oxygen, normally we're going through the TCA oxphase cycle and we're producing the 36 ATP, whereas a cancer cell, even in the presence of oxygen, is not going to be able to produce it's not going to go through the TCA oxphase cycle because the mitochondria is damaged and deranged. And so it's producing all of its energy in the cytoplasm through glycolysis. And so when we look at kind of the simplistic model of how a ketogenic diet affects cancer development, we know that cancer cells need glucose to thrive. And so instead of the cells using glucose for energy, they absorb ketones, right? Because we cut down the amount of carbohydrates. We cut down the amount of sugar that's available to feed the cancer cells. Now, that's a simplistic layman term. What we actually know that ketones, the impact they have on cancer cells, we know that, number one, they create cancer cell oxidative stress. And so they're very destructive. When we have elevated ketones, it's actually very destructive on the cancer cells because the cancer cells need a lot of glucose or glutamine in order to produce their own glutathione levels, which protect them from oxidative stress. So elevating our ketones actually has a chemoprotective effect against these cancer cells. It's also anti-angiogenic, meaning that basically cancer cells need higher levels of insulin and glucose in order to produce more blood flow. And again, cancer cells are really selfish cells that are trying to drive as much blood flow as possible to them so they can get all the nutrients. They're trying to steal as much nutrients from the body as possible. So we know that ketones also are powerful for reducing inflammation in the body. And cancer cells love to be in an inflammatory matrix where it's just a whole bunch of immune-mediating inflammatory agents producing all this inflammation. And so they love to thrive in that. Ketones will also promote apoptosis in these abnormal cells because they help to stimulate things like the AMPK pathway, which we'll talk about in a second. And they also act as an inhibitor of histone deacetylases, which are genetic pathways that the cancer cells use to proliferate. And so this is actually an epigenetic modulating component of the ketones. And so I tell people all the time, a ketogenic diet itself is not going to eliminate cancer. Okay, now it may if it's like a slow-growing cancer or something along those lines. But if you've been diagnosed with cancer, I wouldn't rely only on a ketogenic diet to get well. But it should be the foundation. It should be the foundational nutritional perspective that we then want to implement some sort of oxidative therapies because ketones are going to basically metabolically stress the cancer cells and make them more susceptible to damage from oxidative therapies. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, big thing that one of your cell protection genes is called your P53 protein. And this is kind of like a security guard. It helps protect against abnormal cell development. Normally, the P53 gene will sense when the cell starts functioning abnormally and developing abnormally. Kind of like when we make copies of copies. If you have a copy machine and you're making copies of copies, over time they start to get blurry and dull. If one slightly moves out of position, it gets blurry and dull. And if we continue to make copies of the copies, ultimately we're going to end up with an illegible piece of paper. Well, it's kind of the same thing with our cell division. And so as the cell division becomes abnormal, the P53 gene triggers the body or the cell to repair itself or to go through a process of apoptosis or programmed cell death. Whereas we know with cancer cells, we have a dysfunctional P53 gene with cancer cells. Okay, so this is important because ketones are an epigenetic modulator. So they can help to modulate how these genes function and protect things like the P53 gene. Also, we know that when we have excessive sugar burning or glucose fermentation, we end up creating a massive amount of oxidative stress, and that oxidative stress damages the P53 gene. That's the number one thing that affects the P53 gene is oxidative stress. And obviously, chemicals from our environment play a role in that. Radiation plays a role, heavy metals, things like that. But certainly, too much glycation, too much sugar burning will do that. Now, another genetic pathway that I wanted to mention is the MTOR pathway, the mammalian target gene of rapamycin. And this is a building pathway. It's a cell-building gene pathway. And so when we don't have enough MTOR, we end up with muscle wasting, okay? And so you see sometimes when people aren't aging well, they lose all their muscle tissue, they get really, really thin and gaunt. That is a sign of not enough mTOR activation, right? Or insensitivity to mTOR. When we get the right amount of mTOR, we have good muscle growth. We're well developed. But if we get too much, we're going to end up with something like cancer, or we can also accelerate the aging process in a negative manner as well. And so the major inhibitors of mTOR, and in our society today, I mean, if you have access to 3 square meals a day, like if you have plenty of food in your house, if you're eating a Western diet, okay, you really need to try to suppress your mTOR pathway. You don't necessarily want to stimulate it all the time. Okay, now, maybe in certain countries, if you're only able to get a little bit of food, you might want to do more to stimulate it. But in our country, we certainly don't. Okay, and so we want to do things to help regulate it and control it. We do actually want to stimulate it, but for short periods of time. Okay, so the major things that are going to inhibit the mTOR pathway are going to be things like fasting. This is one of the reasons why I'm a huge fan of intermittent fasting, extended fasting. Ketosis creates this sort of environment to suppress mTOR. Caffeine, so doing something like a black coffee, as long as you respond well to it, doesn't give you cravings or hunger or cravings or make you feel jittery or have anxiety or anything like that, then it's probably inhibiting the mTOR pathway. Also polyphenols like quercetin, curcumin, ECGC, resveratrol. These are all great. You also have ones in like ginger, for example. It has 6-chagiol in ginger. You've got oregano. You've got rosemary with rosmarinic acid and carvacrol. So a lot of these things can help to inhibit the mTOR pathway, whereas the activators are going to be a very high protein diet, high carbohydrate diet. And you think about a bodybuilder. Bodybuilder is somebody that's really activating the mTOR pathway. Usually they're eating a high protein diet, oftentimes a high carbohydrate diet. They're doing a lot of exercise and strength training, oftentimes supplementing with branched chain amino acids. And they result typically with high insulin, high testosterone, and also inflammation when they're doing that. And so I'm a fan of activating mTOR, but only for a short period of time. So what I personally like to do is I like to exercise fasting for 18 to 24 hours, and then I work out. So today, like I finished dinner at 7 p.m. yesterday, so I will be working out around 1 o'clock today, and then I will eat after that. Okay, and so that exercise, strength training, I'm going to be doing squats, things like that, is going to help stimulate mTOR. But then also, and then right afterwards, I might even take some branched amino acids and have a great meal with protein in it, okay, to stimulate that mTOR, but then I get back into a fasting mode, or I might, today I'll eat 2 meals in roughly a 5 to 6 hour eating window. So I'm stimulating mTOR, but then after that, I'm getting a big inhibition of mTOR because I'm doing the fasting. So I recommend something like at least a 2-to-1 fasting to building phase, especially for somebody that is dealing with cancer, where we are inhibiting mTOR at least twice as much as we're activating it. So if you were to fast for 16 hours and eat in an 8-hour eating window, that's a good place to start for somebody that has cancer. And I might even narrow that window down to something like 4 to 6 hours of eating. And if they're overweight, I might even go to 1 meal a day, okay? So we can really inhibit that mTOR pathway and activate the AMPK pathway. This AMPK pathway is a natural inhibitor of mTOR, helps improve our insulin sensitivity, helps stimulate the production of ketones, improves mitochondrial function, and has very, very much of an anti-cancer effect. So that's what we're going to stimulate when we are doing intermittent or extended fasting. And exercise as well will stimulate mTOR, but also stimulate AMPK. So it's a good balancer, getting good regular exercise and strength training. So when I was talking about earlier, I mentioned how a ketogenic diet itself is not going to get rid of cancer for people that are diagnosed or fast-growing cancers. Typically, it's not the strategy that you want to do alone in order to heal, but it should be a foundational strategy because we know cancer is really a metabolic disease. That's what the Warburg Effect is all about. It's got to be treated with metabolic therapy. And so basically, the ketogenic diet is your metabolic therapy that stresses the cancer cells. Okay, now cancer cells can also use glutamine to produce energy. Now, that doesn't mean the supplement glutamine. That means glutamine that it's going to grab from the body. Glutamine is the most abundant amino acid in the body. And very, very, it's easy for the cancer cell, in a sense, to get access to the glutamine. Now, not all cancer cells are good at using glutamine for energy, okay? And so there are certain ones that are more glycolytic, so they're more stuck in burning glucose. And so ketogenic diet obviously is going to have a more powerful effect on the cancer cells that are running off of a higher percentage of glucose than glutamine. And in some cases, a glutamine blocking drugs, or they're being studied right now to help restrict glucose uptake into the cancer cells and glutamine uptake. And so those are both the press phases. Now, the pulse phase is where we use some sort of oxidative therapy. And so in the mainstream model, they're going to use chemotherapy or radiation, well-known, well-researched oxidative therapies. The problem is when they do chemotherapy and radiation without using a metabolic therapy, without metabolically stressing the cancer cell, they're going to damage a lot more healthy cells. They're actually going to it's more of a diffuse release of the chemotherapy and radiation, a lot more side effects, and a lot less effective results. So chemotherapy and radiation should only and always be used in conjunction with a metabolic therapy. So the metabolic therapy should be in place: fasting, ketosis, possibly glutamine blocking drugs, and then add in the chemotherapy and the radiation. It's going to be a lot more targeted because the cancer cells are going to be metabolically stressed. They're more vulnerable. They have a lot more insulin receptors. They're uptaking the chemotherapy and the radiation at a higher level. Now, if you want to avoid chemotherapy and radiation, you can try using hyperbaric oxygen and IV therapy, IV vitamin C, IV ozone. These things, the great thing about oxygen therapy as well as the vitamin C or the ozone, the oxygen and the vitamin C and ozone are all healthy for normal cells, whereas chemotherapy and radiation are damaging. They're actually carcinogenic for normal cells. Whereas the oxygen strengthens your normal cells, but it's toxic for the cancer cells. Oxygen destroys cancer cells. Vitamin C coming through the IV or ozone is toxic for the cancer cells. So you want to have this sort of combination. So again, you can go mainstream route or natural health route, but you should always have the press stage in place. And you can see here where I talk about getting the GKI as close to 1 or as low as possible. That is the glucose ketone index. And let me show you guys that real quick. Okay. So here's how that's calculated. Number one, you measure your glucose levels. So you get a blood ketone glucose index meter. Let me see if I have, I don't have a picture of that. Okay, but Keto Mojo is a great company for that. So you want to measure your glucose levels. So in this case, 76 here. You want to measure your blood ketone levels. Okay, so in this person's case, it's 2.2. You divide your blood glucose levels by 18, and then you divide that number by your blood ketone levels. So for this individual, their result is 1.9. Now, for nutritional ketosis, okay, if you're between 1 and 1 and 4 to 1, right? So if you're 4 or less, like in this case, this person's in ketosis. However, for chronic diseases, in particular cancer, you want to try to get this glucose ketone index as close to 1 to 1 as possible, which means you're going to need these ketones to really be elevated, and that's going to help drive down the blood sugar. So doing more fasting is a way to do that, okay? So that really helps with that press phase and getting your, again, glucose down, your ketones up, getting that as close to 1 to 1 as possible. Now, the real food ketogenic diet that you want to practice is going to be, you know, in a sense, especially with cancer, it's going to be a low protein diet because we know high protein drives that MTOR pathway. So, you know, when you do protein, certainly doing it from the right sources, maybe a tiny, you know, very small amount, grass-fed, organic animal products, wild-caught seafood, organic pasture-raised eggs, things like that. But you actually want to keep your protein levels between 0.5 to 1.0 grams per kilogram. So if I weigh 160 pounds, that's roughly around 73 kilograms of body weight. I want to keep my protein levels down between, let's say, 35 grams to 70 grams of protein, somewhere in that range. And if my cancer is fast growing, I actually want it to be closer to that 35 grams of protein a day. And in some cases, I may even want to go to 0 grams of protein and do more extended fasting, 5, 10, 12-day fasts, in order to really suppress that mTOR pathway, reduce inflammation, upregulate those ketones, get that GKI around 1 to 1 or better, you know, where you actually have where it's under 1, and really ramp up autophagy and cell healing. So that's powerful. Now, when you do eat, you want a lot of healthy fat sources, olive oil, olives, avocados, right? Nutrient-dense fat sources, low-carb veggies, okay? So you can see a picture here, lemons, limes, broccoli, asparagus, cauliflower, green leafies, lots of great herbs, basil, oregano, thyme, turmeric, cinnamon, things like that. Really, really powerful stuff. Fermented vegetables, pickles, kimchi, sauerkraut, stuff like that. Fantastic for the body. Raw nuts and seeds. You can do a little bit of those when you have cancer. Filtered water, obviously really good water. And if you're going to do any sweetening, I would recommend it in moderation, but you can do monk fruit or stevia as your top sweetening agents. You can do erythritol or some sort of sugar alcohol. However, if you do get digestive issues or if any of the sweetening agents causes an increase in cravings, hunger and cravings, then I would minimize those. So that's the key there. So that's real food keto. Again, with cancer patients, you can see normally, you know, we're looking at somewhere between sedentary individual, you know, 0.8 to a gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. Active individuals, especially people trying to build muscle, you might even go up to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. But your cancer patient, you may need to drive it down further, like more like 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight when they are in their eating window. And so it just really depends on the individual. But going lower on that protein can be really powerful for suppressing the mTOR pathways, activating more autophagy, more cell healing. So again, you know, fasting is going to stimulate this process of autophagy where the body repairs these abnormal cells, right? So it goes in, repairs the dysfunctional mitochondria, gets rid of, you know, bad P53 genes and helps produce new, healthy, stronger P53 genes to protect the cell. This is really what we want to be stimulating. And as a cancer preventative tool, we want to be stimulating autophagy every single day. We want to be stimulating some level of autophagy, ideally. Maybe not everybody's able to do that, but that's the goal. If you're keto adapted, you're going to start developing autophagy between 14 to 16 hours fasted. Okay, and if you can do fasted exercise, like I was talking about earlier, where you're fasting 16, 18 hours, maybe even 24 hours, and then exercising intensely, you're going to drive up even more autophagy during that process. So that can be a really powerful preventative strategy to make sure you never develop cancer. So I would highly recommend doing something along those lines. We talked about the GKI, glucose ketone index. There's also an article, that's linked to in the description. So if you want more information on the GKI, do go through that in the article. Now, some key tips for having success with a ketogenic diet: certainly making sure you're well hydrated. Super important, when you're fasting. Very important to hydrate well. Some people will do dry fasting. I don't typically recommend it. Just because good hydration is going to help keep the bowels moving. And I'm a huge fan of keeping everything moving in the body. I mean, we want it to be like a river, not like a pond that just stays stagnant and rots and putrefies. We want to make sure that things are moving through us like a river, and we're able to really eliminate a lot of chemicals, toxins, and bad stuff that might be in our system. And we also know that when we're on a ketogenic diet or when we're fasting, we're actually going to lose more electrolytes. And so taking a little bit of salts can be helpful. And then also what comes